Alright everybody, good afternoon. The Detroit Lions were suddenly thrown into the middle of a bizarre story that caught a lot of fans off guard, because according to multiple national reports, there was apparently a moment back in 2021 when the organization was preparing to hire Matt Campbell before everything changed, and Dan Campbell became the head coach instead. And the reason this became such a huge topic again is because the story started spreading everywhere at once. CBS mentioned it, ESPN talked about it, other national outlets picked it up, and before long, Lions fans were debating whether Dan Campbell was actually the team's first choice or not. But once you really start digging into the details, the entire thing starts feeling a lot more complicated than the headlines made it seem. According to the reports, Matt Campbell, who was coaching at Iowa State at the time, had supposedly agreed in principle to become the Lions' next head coach during the 2021 coaching search. Some versions of the story even claim Detroit was prepared to give him a massive long-term contract worth nearly $70 million over 8 years. Then suddenly, according to those reports, Campbell changed his mind and stayed at Iowa State, leaving Detroit to pivot toward Dan Campbell afterward. That immediately created reactions from fans, because the moment you hear something like that, the first thing people think is whether Dan Campbell was somehow a backup option. And honestly, when you look at what Dan Campbell has become for this franchise, it almost feels impossible to imagine the Lions without him now. But this is where the situation becomes interesting, because Detroit sources pushed back hard against the reports almost immediately. There were people connected locally to the organization saying the pursuit of Matt Campbell never even advanced beyond an initial interview stage. In other words, according to those sources, there was never a finalized agreement, never a true commitment, and never a moment where the Lions thought they officially had their head coach before losing him. And honestly, when you look at the context surrounding that coaching search, the local version starts making a lot more sense. Remember what the Lions were looking for at that exact moment in franchise history. The organization had just come out of the Matt Patricia era, and internally they were determined to completely change the culture. Everything about Patricia's time in Detroit had become associated with rigidity, control, and trying to recreate the New England Patriot way without actually having the foundation that made it work there. The Lions were exhausted from that approach. The locker room energy was bad, the relationships reportedly suffered, and the franchise clearly wanted someone completely different. That is where Dan Campbell fit almost perfectly. The people leading the coaching search were not just looking for football intelligence, they were looking for leadership style. Chris Spielman had a major voice in the process, and one of the biggest things Detroit reportedly wanted was a collaborator. They wanted someone who would communicate, someone who valued relationships, someone who understood players personally, and someone who could build a coaching staff through connections and trust. That description sounds exactly like Dan Campbell. He had NFL playing experience. He had already been inside NFL coaching staffs. He had relationships around the league. Players respected him immediately because he had lived the life they were living. Even before he coached his first game in Detroit, people around the NFL constantly described him as authentic. That mattered to the Lions after everything they had just experienced. Now compare that to Matt Campbell at the time. Matt Campbell was a successful college coach. Absolutely. What he did at Iowa State earned respect across college football, but he did not have NFL coaching experience. He did not have deep NFL coaching connections compared to Dan Campbell. He was not a former NFL player, and when you line up everything Detroit publicly said they wanted during that search, Dan Campbell checks nearly every box while Matt Campbell really does not. That is why so many Lions fans are struggling to fully believe the national reports now. Because if Dan Campbell was almost literally built in a laboratory to match what Detroit said they wanted in 2021, then why would Matt Campbell have truly been the choice over him? And honestly, maybe the funniest part of this entire story is that Dan Campbell himself joked during his introductory press conference that the Lions hired the right Campbell. At the time, it felt like a harmless joke, but now fans are revisiting it because of these reports and trying to connect dots years later. But regardless of how the search unfolded behind closed doors, there is one reality nobody can deny anymore. Dan Campbell completely changed the identity of the Detroit Lions. When people think about this franchise today, his face is one of the very first images that comes to mind. That says everything. For years, the Lions were known nationally for disappointment, instability, and rebuilding cycles that never seem to end. Now the franchise is associated with toughness, belief, aggression, and unity. Players fight for this coach. Fans believe in this coach. The city connects with this coach. And that is why this story created such strong reactions emotionally, because fans almost feel protective over what Dan Campbell represents now. Nobody even wants to imagine an alternate reality where this era never happened, because think about where the Lions are today compared to where they were before he arrived. The culture shifted completely, national perception changed, players bought in emotionally, veterans wanted to stay, young players developed confidence. Even the fan base itself changed from expecting disaster to expecting meaningful football. That transformation became bigger than wins and losses alone. So even if there really was a moment where Matt Campbell was discussed seriously behind the scenes, it is hard to look at the results now and believe the Lions ended up anywhere except exactly where they were supposed to be. And maybe that is the biggest reason this story exploded again. It is not really about Matt Campbell anymore. It is about realizing just how much Dan Campbell has become the face of the Detroit Lions organization, and maybe even the face of Detroit sports entirely right now. So now the question becomes simple for Lions fans. Do you believe Detroit truly almost hired Matt Campbell back in 2021? Or do you think the national reports completely misunderstood what actually happened behind the scenes? The more you think about this entire situation, the more it really highlights just how dramatically things have changed for the Detroit Lions under Dan Campbell, because there was a time when this franchise was constantly searching for identity. Every coaching hire felt uncertain, every rebuild felt temporary, every promise about changing the culture eventually collapsed under pressure. That is why this story about Matt Campbell suddenly hits such a nerve with fans, because it forces people to revisit one of the most important decisions in modern franchise history. And honestly, looking back now, it almost feels impossible to separate the Lions from Dan Campbell's personality. You see it everywhere. You see it in the way players talk after games. You see it in the way veterans defend each other publicly. You see it in the physical style the team plays with every Sunday. Even when Detroit loses, the attitude never disappears. The fight never disappears. That became the identity of the team, and it started from the head coach. That is why so many fans immediately pushed back against the idea that Dan Campbell could have somehow been viewed as a second option. Because from the outside now, it feels like he was always the perfect choice for this team. And when you go back to the beginning of his tenure, remember how many people doubted him nationally. A lot of analysts focused entirely on the emotional press conferences. They laughed at the kneecap comments. They questioned whether he was too emotional or too raw to succeed as a head coach. Some people treated him like a motivational speaker instead of a legitimate football leader. But inside Detroit, players responded differently almost immediately. The locker room believed him because they felt authenticity. That word keeps coming up around Dan Campbell for a reason. Players trusted that he was genuine. They trusted that he would fight for them publicly. They trusted that he understood what NFL players go through because he had lived it himself. That relationship building aspect became one of the biggest foundations of the turnaround. And it is important to remember something else here too. Dan Campbell did not walk into an easy situation. The roster still needed major rebuilding. Expectations nationally were low. The franchise was still carrying years of disappointment. Yet somehow, even during the difficult early stretches, players continued buying into the vision. That is extremely rare in the NFL. Usually when losses pile up, frustration starts dividing a locker room. Instead, Detroit kept getting more connected. That says a lot about leadership. This is also why the idea of fit matters so much when organizations hire coaches. Sometimes the most talented football mind is not automatically the best match for a specific team environment. The Lions clearly needed more than schemes and playbooks after the Patricia era. They needed emotional reconstruction inside the building. They needed belief restored. They needed trust rebuilt between players, coaches, and ownership. Dan Campbell became the bridge for all of that, and give credit to the people involved in that search process too, because whether every report about Matt Campbell was accurate or not, the Lions ultimately landed on someone who completely reshaped the trajectory of the franchise. Sheila Hamp trusted the process. Chris Spielman reportedly emphasized leadership and collaboration. Brad Holmes aligned with Campbell almost immediately. That combination ended up changing everything for Detroit. Now look at the perception around the league. The players want to come to Detroit now. National media talks about the Lions differently now. Primetime games feel normal now. Expectations are real now. And perhaps most importantly, fans finally feel connected emotionally to the team in a way that lasts beyond individual seasons. That connection starts with Dan Campbell. Even the smallest details about him became symbolic for the fan base. The emotional speeches, the aggressive fourth down decisions. The willingness to defend players publicly, the accountability after losses. Fans saw a coach who genuinely cared about representing the city correctly, and in Detroit, that matters deeply. That is why this Matt Campbell story became more emotional than logical for many people. It was never truly about comparing coaching resumes. It became about protecting what this current era means to the fan base. Lions supporters waited decades to feel this kind of belief consistently, so naturally they react strongly anytime a story appears that makes it sound like the franchise almost went in another direction. And maybe the biggest takeaway from all of this is how fragile turning points can be in the NFL. One different decision can alter an entire franchise timeline. One coaching hire can change culture, player development, locker room chemistry, fan confidence, and even national respect. The Lions know that better than almost anyone, because for years those decisions kept going wrong. This time, they got it right. Whether Matt Campbell was seriously considered or not may never fully be answered publicly. Different reports will continue existing. Different insiders will tell different versions of the story, but what cannot be debated anymore is the result. Dan Campbell became more than just a head coach in Detroit. He became the emotional center of the organization. And honestly, that might be why Lions fans feel so strongly about defending him in conversations like this. They are not just defending a coach anymore. They are defending the identity of the modern Detroit Lions. Now heading into the future, expectations are completely different from what they were when Campbell first arrived. Fans are no longer hoping the Lions become respectable someday. They expect this team to compete. They expect playoff football. They expect Detroit to stay relevant nationally. That pressure is higher now, but it also proves how far the franchise has come under this leadership, and maybe that is the ultimate irony of this entire story. A rumor that was supposed to create debate about whether the Lions almost hired someone else instead ended up reminding everyone just how valuable Dan Campbell has become to this franchise. And what makes this entire conversation even more fascinating is how quickly the perception of Dan Campbell changed once the Lions started proving they were building something real. Early in his tenure, there were still people around the league questioning whether emotion alone could sustain a winning culture in the NFL. Some critics thought eventually the speeches would lose their impact. Others believed the aggressive mentality would backfire over time. But instead of fading, the identity of this team only became stronger. That is probably the clearest sign that what Detroit built under Campbell is authentic and not just motivational energy. Players continue responding to him years later. That almost never happens unless the locker room truly believes in the message. In the NFL, players can recognize fake leadership immediately. They spend every day around coaches. They know when someone is performing for cameras versus genuinely living the culture they preach. The reason Campbell continues having the respect of the locker room is because the players consistently see the same person privately that fans see publicly. And honestly, that consistency changed the atmosphere around the entire organization. There used to be a feeling around the Lions where every setback felt catastrophic. One losing streak would create panic. One bad season would restart conversations about rebuilding again. Now there is a completely different level of stability, even when injuries